Hello, class, and welcome to this week. This week, we're going to be taking a look at human development. Now, I need to kind of clarify here that we are just skimming along the surface, and we're not going to cover the whole lifespan of a person and the different stages of human development. We're just going to cover up until about your age of development. And the reason for that is you can really cover in a whole degree the detailed aspects of development within a child, because there are so many different aspects of development. What we're going to do this week is look at the fundamental, the complex, the essential processes of human development. And when we speak of development, we're referring to the physiological, the behavioral, the cognitive, the social changes that occur throughout human life, which are guided by both genetic predispositions, what we call nature, and by environmental influences, the nurture, as well as individual choices and the interpretations and attributions that children and adolescents give to their experiences. So all of this plays in to what we call human development. Now, we'll begin our study this week on development at the moment of conception, when the father's sperm unites with the mother's egg, and then we'll consider the prenatal development in the womb. And we'll look at the infancy and the stages of development in infancy and childhood through to adolescence. Because at each of the stages of development, there is unique physical, cognitive, and emotional changes that define the stage and that make each one individual unique and each individual stage unique from all the others. And so you as a person change over time. You're not the same person you were a year ago, and you won't be the same person you are a year from now. Subtle changes take place as we move through developmental stages, and it can be a very stressful, scary time, but it can also be a joyful, exciting time as we learn how we are going to change. Now, I'm going to start off with the psychologist and psychoanalyst Erik Erikson. We'll hear a little bit more in this class about Erik Erikson. One of the things that Erik Erikson did was to propose a model of lifespan development. We can kind of consider the idea that Erikson believed that each life stage has a unique challenge that the person who reaches it must face. And according to Erikson, successful development involves dealing with and resolving the goals and demands of each of the life stages in a positive way. So, for example, a child from birth to about a year old, or up to 18 months, has a key challenge of developing trust versus mistrust. Now, within this age period, this also correlates to other theories and other theorists. For example, the Freudian developmental theory is one of oral or sensory stage. And the key for Erikson is for the child in that first year, year and a half of life, is for the child to develop a feeling of trust in his or her caregivers. From the age of a year and a half to about 3 years, there's a key challenge that takes place. Sometimes parents call this the terrible twos, but Erikson saw it not as a negative, but as a positive. It is the time when a child needs to develop autonomy. So there is this balance between autonomy versus shame and doubt. Which will dominate the child? Will shame and doubt dominate the child, or will autonomy dominate the life of the child. And this all takes place in that 1.5 through to 3 years age. And this is the time when there's a positive resolution to the challenge, ideally when the child learns that what they can and cannot control and develops a sense of free will, a willingness, in essence, to engage the world rather than be ashamed of engaging the world. Then comes age 3 through to 6. And according to Erik Erikson, this is the key challenge of initiative versus guilt. And the positive resolution of this challenge is that the child learns to become independent by exploring, by manipulating, and by taking action. They become a courageous encounterer of reality. Then from ages 6 through to 12 for Erik Erikson, he views that time as a key challenge for developing industry versus inferiority. Do you develop the attitude of, yes, I can do this, or the feeling of, no, there's no point in doing this because I'm going to fail? A positive resolution of this challenge, of this values challenge for the child, is the child learns to do things well or correctly according to the standards set by others, particularly in school. Then comes the age range of 12 through to 18. Often, students in Introduction to Psychology are in this stage of the key challenge of identity versus role confusion. Who am I versus, and where do I fit in versus, I don't know where I fit in. And that can be a difficult challenge. And the positive resolution for this challenge is the adolescent develops a well-defined and positive sense of self in relationship to others. And then comes young adulthood from 19 through to about 40. So you have a long time to figure out this next key challenge according to Erikson. But it's something that needs to be resolved. And that is intimacy versus isolation. How am I going to be intimate with others? In what ways am I going to be intimate with others? Or am I going to isolate myself from others? And who am I going to isolate myself from? And the positive resolution of this challenge is the person develops the ability to give and receive love and to make long-term commitments. Then Erikson sees the age of 40 through to 65 as being one of a key challenge of generativity versus stagnation. Are we producing something within our life, or are we just letting life pass us by? That's generativity versus stagnation. And the positive resolution of this stage of life is the person develops an interest in guiding the development of the next generation. Often this means becoming a parent or caring for others in their development. And then Erikson sees the last key challenge within life occurring approximately around the age of 65 and continuing on for the rest of the life of the person. And that is ego integrity versus despair. And by that, he means that you know who you are, that you're willing to share that with others, and when life comes to an end, you can give it up. Or you spend your life in despair and anger. And the positive resolution of this challenge is the person develops acceptance of his or her life as it was lived. And so you see in there that there are some interesting experiences that take place. some key challenges that often take years and that are major transitions between various stages of life. Now we'll take a look at cognitive development during childhood. Childhood undoubtedly is a time in which lots of changes occur very quickly. The child is growing physically, and cognitive abilities are also developing. And during this time, the child learns to actively manipulate and control the environment, and is first exposed to the requirements of society, particularly things like the need to control the bladder and the bowels. Now, according to Erik Erikson, the challenges that the child must attain in childhood relate to the development of initiative, competence, and independence. Children need to learn to explore the world, to become self-reliant, and to make their own way within the environment. And these skills, they don't happen overnight. Neurological changes during childhood provide children with the ability to do some things at certain ages and yet make it impossible for them to do other things. And this fact was made apparent through the groundbreaking work of a Swiss psychologist by the name of Jean Piaget. During the 1920s, Piaget was administering intelligence tests to children in an attempt to determine the kinds of logical thinking that children were capable of. And in the process of testing them, Piaget became intrigued, not so much about the answers that the children got right, but more by the answers they got wrong. Piaget believed that the incorrect answers the children gave were not mere shots in the dark, but rather represented specific ways of thinking, unique to the child's developmental stage. Just as almost all babies learn to roll over before they learn to sit up by themselves, and learn to crawl before they learn to walk, Piaget believed that children gain their cognitive ability in developmental order. And these insights that children at different ages think in fundamentally different ways led to Piaget's stage of cognitive development. Piaget believed that children do not merely passively learn, but also actively try to make sense of their worlds. He argued that as they learn and mature, children develop what are called schemas. These are patterns of knowledge in long-term memory that help them to remember, to organize, and to respond to information. Furthermore, Piaget thought that when children experience new things, they attempt to reconcile the new knowledge with existing schemas. Piaget believed that the children use two distinct methods in doing so. Methods that he called assimilation and accommodation. When children employ assimilation, they use already developed schemas to understand new information. If children have learned a schema for horses, then they may call the striped animal they see in a zoo a horse rather than a zebra. In this case, children fit the existing schema to the new information and label the new information with the existing knowledge. Accommodation, on the other hand, involves learning new information and thus changing the schema or making a new schema. When a mother says, "No, honey, that's a zebra, not a horse," a child may adapt the schema to fit the new stimulus, learning that there are different types of four-legged animals. only one of which is a horse. Piaget's most important contribution is understanding that cognitive development occurs within these more or less sequential stages. And the fundamental aspect of his theory was the idea that development occurs in unique and distinct stages, with each stage occurring at a specific time, in a sequential manner, and in a way that allows the child to think about the world using new capacities. Now, Piaget's stages of cognitive development really do form a sense of how we can consider a child's way of thinking is so very different from an adult's. So let's take a look at those. The first developmental stage for Piaget was the sensory motor stage, the cognitive stage that begins at birth and lasts until around the age of 2. It's defined by the direct physical interactions that babies have with the objects around them. During this stage, babies form their first schemas by using their primary senses. They stare at, they listen to, they reach out, they hold, they shake, and they taste the things in their environment. During the sensory motor stage, babies use their senses to perceive the world, and they do this in a way that engages the world immensely. It's so central to their understanding that whenever babies do not directly perceive objects, as far as they are concerned, that object does not exist. Piaget found, for instance, that if he first interested babies in a toy and then covered the toy with a blanket, children who were younger than 6 months of age would act as if the toy had disappeared completely. They never tried to find it under the blanket, but would nevertheless smile and reach for it when the blanket was removed. Piaget found that it was not until about 8 months that the children realized that the object was merely covered and not gone from existence. Piaget used the term object permanence to refer to the child's ability to know that an object exists even when the object cannot be perceived. So the basic idea here is Piaget realized that children younger than 8 months of age do not understand that objects are permanent. At about the age of 2 years of age and continuing until about the age of 7 years of age, children move into a pre-operational stage. And during this stage, children begin to use language and to think more about objects with capacity to form mental images. However, their understanding is more intuitive, and they lack much ability to deduce or to reason. The thinking is what is called pre-operational, meaning that the child lacks the ability to operate on or transform objects mentally. Now, in one study done in the 1980s, and this showed that children, a room with a small dollhouse, and inside the room, a small toy was visible behind a small couch. Took the children to another lab room, which was an exact replica of the dollhouse room, but full-sized. When children were a mere 2.5 years old, were asked to find the toy, they did not know where to look for the toy. They were simply unable to make the transition across the changes in room size. However, 3-year-old children, on the other hand, immediately looked for the toy behind the couch, demonstrating that they were improving their operational skills. The inability of young children to view transitions also leads to them being very egocentric, unable to readily see and understand other persons' viewpoints. Developmental psychologists define the theory of the mind as the ability to take another person's viewpoint, and the ability to do so increases rapidly during the pre-operational stage. In one demonstration of the development of the theory of the mind, a researcher showed a child a video of another child, let's call her Anna, putting a ball in a red box. Then Anna leaves the room, and the video shows that while she is gone, a researcher moves the ball from the red box into a blue box. As the video continues, Anna comes back into the room. The child is then asked to point to the box where Anna will probably look to find her ball. Children who are younger than 4 years of age typically are unable to understand that Anna does not know that the ball has been moved, and they will predict that she will look for it in the blue box. After 4 years of age, however, children have developed a theory of the mind. They realize that different people have different viewpoints, and that although she will be wrong, Anna will nevertheless think that the ball is still in the red box. Now, after 7 years of age, through until 11 years of age, the child moves into the concrete operational stage, which is marked by more frequent and more accurate use of transitions, operations, abstract concepts, including some of space, time, and numbers. But they're still not really abstract in the adult sense. An important milestone during the concrete operational stage is the development of conservation, the understanding that changes in the form of an object do not necessarily mean changes in the quantity of the object. Children younger than 7 years generally think that a glass of milk that is tall holds more milk than a glass of milk that is shorter and wider. And they continue to believe this even when they see the same milk poured back and forth between the glasses. It appears that these children focus only on one dimension, in this case the height of the glass, and ignore the other dimension, the width. However, when children reach the concrete operational stage, their abilities to understand such transformations make them aware that, although the milk looks different in different glasses, the amount must be the same. Children younger than about 7 years of age do not understand the principles of conservation. At around 11 years of age, children enter the formal operational stage, which is marked by the ability to think in abstract terms and to use scientific and philosophical lines of thought. Children in the formal operational stage are better able to systematically test alternative ideas to determine their influence on outcomes. For instance, rather than haphazardly changing different aspects of a situation that allows no clear conclusion to be drawn, they systematically make changes in one thing at a time and observe what difference that particular change makes. They learn to use deductive reasoning, such as if this, then that. and they become capable of imagining situations that might be, rather than just those that actually exist. Piaget's theories have made a substantial and lasting contribution to developmental psychology. His contributions include the idea that children are not merely passive receptacles of information, but rather actively engage in acquiring new knowledge and making sense of the world around them. This general idea has generated many other theories of cognitive development, each designed to help us better understand the development of the child's information processing skills. Furthermore, the extensive research that Piaget's theory has stimulated has generally supported his beliefs that the order in which cognition develops. Furthermore, the extensive research that Piaget's theories have stimulated has generally supported his belief about the order in which cognition develops. Piaget's work has also been applied in many other domains. For instance, many teachers make use of Piaget's stages of development for educational approaches aimed at the level children are developmentally prepared for. Over the years, Piagetian ideas have been refined. For instance, it is now believed that object permanence develops gradually, rather than more immediately, as a true stage model would predict, and that it can sometimes develop much earlier than Piaget expected. Now, another theory has to do with the sociocultural theory of a Russian scholar by the name of Lev Vygotsky, who argued that cognitive development is not isolated entirely within the child, but also occurs, at least in part, through social interaction. And so there's an extension then of Vygotsky's sociocultural theory in the idea of community learning, in which children serve as both teachers and learners. And so we'll take a little bit of time now and look at social development during childhood and the knowing of the self and the self-concept, because I think that's a very interesting aspect, as well as the ideas of attachment. It is through the remarkable increases in cognitive ability that children learn to interact with and understand their environments. But these cognitive skills are only part of the changes that are occurring during childhood. Equally crucial is the development of the child's social skills. The ability to understand, to predict, to create bonds with the other people in their environment. And one of the important milestones in a child's social development is learning about his or her own self-existence. This self-awareness is known as consciousness, and the content of consciousness is known as the self-concept. The self-concept is a knowledge representation or schema that contains knowledge about us, including our beliefs about our personality traits, physical characteristics, abilities, values, goals, and roles, as well as the knowledge we exist as individuals. Now, some animals, like chimpanzees, orangutans, and perhaps dolphins, have at least a primitive sense of self. Now, in one study in the 1970s, researchers painted a red dot in the foreheads of anesthetized chimpanzees and placed each animal in a cage with a mirror. When the chimps woke up and looked in the mirror, they touched the dot on their faces, not the dot on the faces in the mirror. And these actions suggest at least that the chimps understood that they were looking at themselves, not at other animals. And thus we can assume that they are able to realize that they exist as individuals. On the other hand, most other animals, including, for instance, dogs, cats, and monkeys, rarely realize that it is themselves in the mirror. And infants who have a similar red dot painted on their foreheads recognize themselves in a mirror in the same way that chimps do. And they do this by about 18 months of age. The child's knowledge about the self continues then to develop as the child grows. By age 2, the infant becomes aware of his or her sex as a boy or a girl. By age 4, self-descriptions are likely to be based on physical features such as hair color and possessions. And by age 6, the child is able to understand basic emotions and the concepts of traits, being able to make statements such as, "I'm a nice person." Soon after children enter school, at about the ages of 5 or 6, they begin to make comparisons with other children, a process known as social comparison. For example, a child might describe himself as being faster than one boy, but slower than another boy. Now, according to Erickson, the important component of this process is development of competence and autonomy, the recognition of one's own abilities relative to other children. And children increasingly show awareness of social situations. They understand that other people are looking at and judging them the same way that they are looking at and judging others. And one of the most important behaviors a child must learn is how to be accepted by others, to develop a close and meaningful social relationship. Emotional bonds that we develop with those with whom we feel closest, and particularly the bonds that an infant develops with the mother or caregiver, are referred to as attachment. And attachment becomes an incredibly important part of childhood development. As late as the 1930s, psychologists believed that children who were raised in institutions such as orphanages and who received good physical care and proper nourishment would develop normally, even if they had little interaction with their caregivers. But studies by developmental psychologist John Bowlby in the 1950s and others showed that these children did not develop normally. They were usually sickly, emotionally slow, and generally unmotivated. These observations help make it clear that normal infant development requires a successful attachment with a caretaker. Now, in one classic study showing the importance of attachment, Wisconsin University psychologists Harry and Margaret Harlow investigated the response of young monkeys. They separated from their biological mothers to two surrogate mothers introduced to their cages. One, the wire mother, consisted of a round wooden head, a mesh of cold metal wires, and a bottle of milk from which the baby could drink. The second mother was a foam rubber form wrapped in heated terry cloth blankets. The Harlows found that although the infant monkeys went to the wire mother for food, they overwhelmingly preferred and spent significantly more time with the warm terry cloth mother that provided no food but did provide comfort. Now, the Harlow studies confirm that babies have social as well as physical needs. Both monkeys and human babies need a secure base that allows them to feel safe. From this base, we can gain the confidence that they need to venture out and to explore their worlds. Looking back at Erik Erikson's various challenges, there's some agreement here on the importance of secure base, arguing that one of the most important goals of infancy was the development of a basic sense of trust versus mistrust. And then developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth, who was, by the way, a student of John Bowlby, was interested in studying the development of attachments in infants. Ainsworth created a test laboratory that measured an infant's attachment to his or her parent. The test is called the strange situation, a measure of attachment in which young children in which the child's behaviors are assessed in a situation in which the caregiver and a stranger move in and out of the environment. Because it is conducted in a context that is unfamiliar to the child and therefore likely to heighten the child's need for his or her parent, during the procedure, which lasts about 20 minutes, the parent and the infant are first left alone, while the infant explores the room full of toys. Then a strange adult enters the room and talks for a few minutes to the parent, after which the parent leaves the room. The stranger stays with the infant for a few minutes, and then the parent again enters and the stranger leaves the room. During the entire session, a video camera records the child's behaviors, and then all of that behavior is later coded by trained coders. Now, on the basis of their behaviors, the children are categorized into one of four groups, where each group reflects a different kind of attachment relationship with the caregiver. A child with a secure attachment style usually explores freely while the mother is present and engages with the stranger. The child may be upset when the mother departs, but is also happy to see the mother return. A child with an ambivalent, sometimes called an insecure resistant, attachment style, is wary about the situation in general, particularly the stranger, and stays close or even clings to the mother rather than explores the toys. When the mother leaves, the child is extremely distressed and is ambivalent when she returns. The child may rush to the mother, but then fail to cling to her when she picks up the child. A child with an avoidant, sometimes called an insecure avoidant attachment style, will avoid or ignore the mother, showing little emotion when the mother departs or returns. The child may run away from the mother when she approaches. The child will not explore very much, regardless of who is there, and the stranger will not be treated much differently from the mother. And finally, a child with a disorganized attachment style seems to have no consistent way of coping with the stress of the strained situation. The child may cry during the separation, but avoid the mother when she returns. Or the child may approach the child, but then freeze or fall to the floor. Although there are some cultural differences in attachment styles that have been found by researchers, research has also found that the proportion of children who fall into the attachment categories is relatively consistent across cultures. And this comes out as 60% of children will be secure, 10% will be ambivalent, 15% will be avoided, and approximately 15% will be disorganized. Now, you might wonder whether differences in attachment style are determined by the child, nature, or by the parent, nurture. But most developmental psychologists believe that socialization is primary, arguing that a child becomes securely attached when the mother is able and available, to meet the needs of the child in a responsive and appropriate manner, but that the insecure styles occur when the mother is insensitive and responds inconsistently to the child's needs. Now, in a direct test of this idea, Dutch researchers randomly assigned some babies' mothers to a training session in which they learned to better respond to children's needs. And the research found that these mothers' babies were more likely to show a secure attachment style compared to the babies of mothers in a control group that did not receive any training. But the attachment behavior of the child is also likely influenced, at least in part, by temperament, the innate personality characteristics of the infant. Some children are warm, friendly, and responsive, whereas others tend to be irritable, less manageable, and difficult to console. So all of this taken together, it seems safe to say that attachment, like most other developmental processes, is affected by an interplay of genetic and socialization influences. Moving on into adolescence. Adolescence is really defined as the years between the onset of puberty and the beginning of adulthood. In the past, when people were likely to marry in their early 20s or younger, this period might have lasted only 10 years or less, starting roughly between the ages of 12 and 13 and ending by age 20, at which time the child got a job and went to work on the family farm or married and started his or her own family. Today, children mature much more slowly. They move away from home in later ages and maintain ties with their parents longer. For instance, children may go away to university but still receive financial support from parents, and they may come home on weekends or even to live for extended periods of time with their parents. Thus, the period between puberty and adulthood may well last into the late 20s. You can really think of adolescence from a physical perspective and a brain development perspective to continue on to about 25. And there's this merging then into adulthood itself. In fact, it's appropriate now to consider the period of adolescence and that of emerging adulthood, the ages between 18 and the middle of the late 20s, as happening together. So during adolescence, the child continues to grow physically, cognitively, emotionally, changing from a child into an adult. The body grows rapidly in size, and the sexual and reproductive organs become fully functional. At the same time, as adolescents develop more advanced patterns of reasoning and a stronger sense of self, they seek to forge their own identities, developing important attachments with people other than their parents, particularly in Western societies where the need to forge a new independence is critical. And this period can be stressful for many children, many adolescents, as it involves new emotions, the need to develop new relationships, and it is an increasing sense of responsibility and independence. Some psychologists have called this the Sturm und Drang, the storm and stress of life, which is adolescence. Now, although adolescence can be a time of stress for many teenagers particularly, most of them weather the trials and tribulations fairly successfully. For example, the majority of adolescents experiment with alcohol sometime before high school graduation. Although many will have been drunk at least once, relatively few teenagers will develop long-lasting drinking problems or permit alcohol to adversely affect their school or personal relationships. Similarly, a great many teenagers break the law as adolescents, but very few people develop criminal careers. Now, these facts do not, however, mean that using drugs or alcohol really is a good idea. The use of recreational drugs can really have substantial negative consequences, having to do with dependence, addiction, and even brain damage or restriction in brain development. Now, when we look at the physical changes within adolescence, this can be very significant. Adolescence begins with the onset of puberty, a developmental period in which hormonal changes cause rapid physical alterations in the body, culminating in sexual maturity. And although the timing varies to some degree across cultures, the average age for reaching puberty is between 9 and 14 years for girls and 10 and 17 years for boys. Now, puberty begins when the pituitary gland begins to stimulate the production of the male sex hormone testosterone in boys and the female sex hormones estrogen and progesterone in girls. And the release of these sex hormones triggers the development of the primary sex characteristics, the sex organs concerned with reproduction. And these changes include the enlargement of the testicles and the penis in boys and the development of ovaries, uterus, and vagina in girls. In addition, secondary sex characteristics, features that distinguish the two sexes from each other but are not involved in reproduction, are also developed, such as an enlarged Adam's apple, a deeper voice, and pubic and underarm hair in boys, an enlargement of the breasts and hips and appearance of pubic and underarm hair in girls. The enlargement of breasts is usually the first sign of puberty in girls and on average occurs around the ages of 10 to 12. Boys typically begin to grow facial hair between the ages of 14 and 16, and both boys and girls experience a rapid growth spurt during this stage. The growth spurt for girls usually occurs earlier than that for boys, with some boys continuing to grow into their 20s. Now, when it comes to the cognitive development of adolescence, although the most rapid cognitive development occurs during childhood, the brain really does continue to develop throughout adolescence and even into the 20s. And during adolescence, the brain continues to form new neural connections, but it also casts off unused neurons and connections. As teenagers mature, the prefrontal cortex, that is the area of the brain responsible for reasoning, planning, and problem solving, also continues to develop. And myelin, that fatty tissue that forms around axons and neurons and helps speed transmissions between different regions of the brain, that also continues to grow. And adolescents often seem to act impulsively rather than thoughtfully. And this may be, at least in part, because the development of the prefrontal cortex is, in general, slower than the development of the emotional parts of the brain, including the limbic system. Furthermore, the hormonal surge that is associated with puberty, which primarily influences emotional responses, may create strong emotions and lead to impulsive behavior. It has been hypothesized that adolescents may engage in risky behavior, such as smoking, drug use, dangerous driving, and unprotected sex, in part because they have not yet fully acquired the mental ability to curb their impulse behaviors or to make entirely rational judgments. Now, the new cognitive abilities that are attained during adolescence may also give rise to new feelings of egocentrism, in which adolescents believe that they can do anything and that they know better than anyone else, including their parents. Teenagers are likely to be highly self-conscious, often creating an imaginary audience in which they feel that everyone is constantly watching them. Because teens think so much about themselves, they mistakenly believe that others must be thinking of them as well. And so it's no wonder that everything a teen's parents do suddenly embarrasses them when they're in public. Now, when it comes to social development in adolescence, some of the most important changes that occur during adolescence involve the further development of the self-concept and the development of new attachments. Whereas young children are mostly attached to their parents, the important attachments of adolescence move increasingly away from parents and increasingly towards peers. And as a result, parent influences diminish in this stage. And according to Erickson, the main social task of adolescence is to search for a unique identity, the ability to answer the question, who am I? In the search for identity, the adolescent may experience role confusion in which he or she is balancing or choosing among identities, taking on negative or undesirable identities, or temporarily giving up altogether if things are not going well. Now, one approach to assessing identity development was proposed by James Marcia in the 1980s. And in his approach, adolescents are asked questions regarding their exploration of and commitment to issues related to occupation, politics, religion, and sexual behavior. And the responses to questions allow the researchers to classify the adolescent in one of 4 identity categories. And these categories are identity diffusion status, which is where the individual does not have any firm commitments regarding the issues in question and is not making progress towards them. There is the foreclosure status, where the individual has not engaged in an identity experimentation and has established an identity based on the choices or values of others. Then there's the moratorium status. The individual is exploring various choices, but has not yet made a clear commitment to any of them. And then the identity achieved, where the individual has attained a coherent and committed identity that is based on personal decisions. And this is a lifelong process of deciding who you are. So it is something that is part of the overall process, but it is something that also continues on throughout your lifespan. So we're going to stop there, and I hope that you have enjoyed this lecture. You take care. Bye-bye.